Close your mouth, or a fly will eat your tongue.
Or a Dybbuk will jump out of it.
A Dybbuk? What is that?
A Dybbuk? Huh? So tell him already, Mikhail.
It's a demon. Well, sort of a demon, anyway.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum in the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. About a year ago, I was at a swap meet looking through an enormous, unsorted pile of used DVDs. It was the usual mix of mainstream drivel, great films I already own, and head-scratchingly bad movies that are so bad you wonder who actually bought them in the first place. But then, at the bottom of the pile, was a haunting image of a petrified, old-world bearded rabbi, clinging tightly to his prayer shawl with a look of absolute terror in his eyes. It was a 1960 Play of the Week television broadcast of the Dybbuk, directed by Sidney Lumet, and it only cost me a dime. Our guest today knows a lot about the Dybbuk and its undying legacy.
We're delighted to talk with Debra Caplan, an associate professor of theater at the Graduate Center and Baruch College, City University of New York, the author of Yiddish Empire, the Vilna Troupe, Jewish Theater, and the Art of Itinerancy, and co-editor of the Dybbuk Century, the Jewish play that possessed the world. Debra, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Hello, hello. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. For those who are unfamiliar or could use a refresher, what's the basic plot of the Dybbuk?
The basic plot of the Dybbuk, it's kind of like an occult, ghostly Romeo and Juliet with a couple of twists. So there are two star-crossed lovers, Leah and Honen. Their fathers were best friends, and so before they were born, their fathers promised that if they should have a boy and a girl child, that they would betroth them to each other. But Honen's father died not long after the baby was born, and Leah's father got really, really rich and started to have some other priorities in life rather than taking care of his dead best friend's son. So Leah and Honen are like destined to be together. They fall in love. They are drawn to each other, but Leah's father does not want them to get married because Honen is not rich. He is like a poor yeshiva boy. He's a scholar. He's not capitalist enough for her. And so he says that Leah has to marry somebody else who, of course, she doesn't want to marry. Honen is determined to marry her no matter what, one way or another, and he goes deep into Kabbalah, into Jewish mysticism, to try to find some mystical, magical way of solving this problem. But Kabbalah it's dangerous, and he goes a little too deep, and it kills him. He dies sort of spectacularly. So now Leah is supposed to get married to this man she doesn't want to marry, and her love is dead from Jewish mysticism. And she goes to the cemetery before her wedding, which, according to superstition, you are definitely not supposed to do. And she invites the ghost of her bridegroom to come to this wedding that she doesn't want to have. So then there's this big wedding scene. There's a moment where Leah dances with a figure that is supposed to represent death. That's a very iconic scene in the show. And then it comes time for Leah to get married. And right at the absolute final moment, they've done the seven blessings. They've done the seven circles. They're about to step on the glass. Everything is almost done. And suddenly in a deep voice, she says, "You are not my bridegroom." And then she proclaims that basically that Honen, who's now this ghost, has like taken up residence in her body. She is now possessed by a Dybbuk, a spirit of the dead that possesses a living person's body. So of course the whole town kind of freaks out. This is a problem, especially Leah's father, and he's wealthy. He's determined to fix this. He takes her to a wonder-working Hasidic Rebbe who can exercise this Dybbuk. The Rebbe has a really difficult time exercising the Dybbuk. The Dybbuk really wants to stay. This is, of course, the love of his life. He does not want to leave her and move on. In the end, the Rebbe is successful at exercising the Dybbuk after a lot of really ceremonial, ritual things happen with black candles and incantations. Eventually he succeeds. And the moment that the Dybbuk has left Leah, all of the men who have conducted this exorcism, they all go off to go celebrate together with Leah's father. And they leave Leah behind in the synagogue by herself. Leah, who is like passed out after this exorcism, hears a ghostly voice, and that ghostly voice is her lover, Chonen, whose ghost is still sort of hovering in this room somewhere. She says that she wants to be with him. He says, come with me. And then the next thing that happens is everybody finds her dead. They come back and they find her dead because her spirit has gone to be with her lover.
And S. Ansky, tell us a bit about him and his interesting life.
Ansky was a really interesting guy. He was not your average typical playwright. He maybe wasn't really exactly a playwright at all. He was not your average typical writer. So Ansky as a young man was an ethnographer. He kind of came up of age in this moment where ethnography was all the rage in Russia. And he became sort of the head of a Jewish society of ethnographers who went on these expeditions to small towns and shtetlich across Eastern Europe and interviewed people and collected oral histories and documentations. So he spent 2 years conducting these ethnographic expeditions. They had a survey that had like some 700 questions in it that they would ask people, and they also collected recordings of songs and folktales and things like that as well. So he spent his sort of his like early 20s immersed in the folklore and the superstitions of Jews living across Eastern Europe. He was particularly interested in the weird things that people believed. He was pretty secular. He was pretty urban. He was really interested in going into these small towns and learning about the strange supernatural things that people believed. And Dybbuks were a particular fascination. So in the survey, there were so many questions about asking people to talk about if they believed in Dybbuks, if they'd ever encountered someone who had been possessed, what happened. So he collected all of this material. Then he sort of aspired to become a writer from being an ethnographer, and he struggled to find success. He wrote a couple of one-act plays that got produced but didn't do so well. They were kind of weird. He became obsessed with writing this play, The Dybbuk, based on the ethnographic material that he had collected, and based on especially this Dybbuk lore that he had collected in succession over these 2 years. He first wrote the play in Russian. You can actually read the Russian version of this play in translation, the first version. It's not as good of a play. It has a very, how can I say it, a very corny prologue and epilogue that really doesn't really fit with the way that I see this play as where it went. But there's kind of this earlier draft in Russian. He tries to get that produced. He translates it into Hebrew and does another version in Hebrew. He tries to get that produced. He writes a version in Yiddish. He's kind of writing the 3 versions and editing them simultaneously. And basically, Ansky becomes just completely obsessed. He feels that the Dybbuk is the best thing he's ever written and the best thing he's done in his entire life. And he just wants it produced. He wants to see it on a stage. He doesn't care where, what language. He comes very, very close a few times. The biggest thing that happens is that the Moscow Art Theater, Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater, says, we like this play in Russian. We will produce it in 1917. And he is just over the moon about this. And then the Russian Revolution happens, the first Russian Revolution. And the Moscow Art Theater says, sorry, we need to do political plays now. This weird ghost Jewish play is just not on the roster anymore. So he gets canceled for that. He takes it to all of these like Yiddish literary salons and tries to get his peers interested in the play so that hopefully somebody will fund it, produce it. And people tell him it's a terrible play. Over and over, he gets this play read, and people come up to him and they say, this is not really a play, it's kind of ethnography. You should learn something about playwriting. They tell him there's no dramatic tension, there's no plot, that the characters are boring. This famous actor, Avram Marevsky, who later goes on to star in the Dybbuk as the Hasidic Rabbi, Reb Israel, and makes his career on it. He's at one of these readings, and he goes up to Ansky afterwards and says, I'm sorry, but I just don't think there's any good parts for actors in this play. What an irony that this becomes the defining role of his career. So people didn't understand what this play was, and they just didn't get it. It was too different, too weird. Ansky then is struggling with tuberculosis. So he's not that old, but it's really the end of his life. And he goes to a sanatorium in Otwosk, Poland, to recuperate from exhaustion, burnout, and tuberculosis, kind of all at the same time. And he starts to recognize that he's pretty sick, and he is just despairing. All he can talk to anybody about is, all I wanted was to see the Dybbuk on a stage, and it's not happening, and now I'm sick. And this group of young actors comes to him at the sanatorium, and they say, hey, we've heard about your play. The actors are very young. They're in their early 20s. They're kind of up and coming. They have a different way of thinking about the world. And they say, we read your play, and we think it's really interesting. We would like to produce it. Ansky is over the moon. This is his dream come true. He's talking to them at the sanatorium, having these great conversations. He's like buzzing with excitement. It's all he can talk about. And 3 weeks later, he's dead. So he never saw his play produced. Never, ever. But it outlived him.
As I understand it, part of the ethnographic research was sort of motivated by this idea of a nation within a nation. Russia was building itself in the mold of nationalism, and the Jews of Russia were trying to find their own place within that as a nation. And how does that sort of play out in the choice of the Dybbuk?
It's intensely Jewish, and the play is just peppered with ethnographic details about how Jews lived. There's all sorts of, one of the reasons people criticize this play is that there's all sorts of details that you don't really need for the plot, that are just really specific things that he encountered on his travels. So, for example, at the beginning of the play, there's a lot of attention drawn to the fact that there's a grave in the middle of the town, and the grave is of a bride and groom who were killed on their wedding day in 1648 during the Khmelnytsky uprising, which was a big trauma for Jews in Eastern Europe. This was just something he saw. He went to a town where they had this gravestone at the center, and life just carried on around this trauma memorial, and it just stuck with him. So he put it in and made a big deal out of it. And there's a lot of little things like that. I think that you're absolutely right that it came from this kind of nationalism place. The other thing is that theater kind of came from that place as well. There was a real energy about catching up with the Russian and Polish theater to prove that Jews had this legitimate culture in a public way. And, these ideas about theater and nation are very old and very pervasive in Europe. In Germany, this is a huge part of the organization of German national identity is through theater. And so it's seen as a model way to do that. So from both angles, from the theater angle, from the desire to write plays, which is totally coming from a proving cultural national legitimacy place, and also the ethnographic angle, which is the hot new thing in discovering what is Russia and what are Russians really like. It's coming at it from both ways.
Stories of the Dybbuk date back to at least the 16th century. Why do you think Dybbuk folklore began in the first place, and why was it such a staple of Eastern European folklore?
Jews didn't just believe in Dybbuks. Jews believed in a lot of different supernatural things. Eastern European Jewish culture was very superstitious and very full of magical ideas. That was really deeply baked into the culture. So there's lots of different types of ghosts and spirits. There's even different types of spirits that might possess you for different purposes. Dybbuk is just one subset. So I think the question is a little maybe broader than that, because I think it's really, why was there so much of this sort of superstitious belief? And I think two things. I think part of it is coming out of a place of tremendous uncertainty and lack of control. So, this is a community for whom bad things happened all the time, and there were not a lot of mechanisms of control. And so the idea that you could appeal to or push away spirits that might bring positive or negative things, I think offered people a sensation of control, right? So like Eastern European Jews say, Kinahera, right? No evil eye when you talk about something good that you might want to happen. Because I think it gives you a sense of like linguistic control, right? You definitely don't know if good things are going to happen, especially if you're a Jew in Eastern Europe. But maybe if you put that out into the universe, then maybe the good thing will happen, right? Prevent the bad thing from happening. And so I think that a lot of this sort of magical focus and interest in spirits comes from that. Possession stories, I mean, possession is a thing in like every culture, right? Ghostly possession, every culture kind of has their stories about that. I think there's something deeply interesting to human beings about the idea of like one person or one soul inhabiting another person. And then I think there's maybe an element of almost like Salem witch trial to this, in that like, when Ansky was and his team were interviewing all of these people all across Eastern Europe, most people said, oh yeah, there was a Dybbuk in my town this year, and then this year, and then this year, and here's what happened. And so of all the Dybbuk stories that they collected, the legends, most of them, upwards of 90%, are young women being possessed by male spirits. And often around weddings and wedding nights. And so, I think there's a piece of this that, if you're a young woman and you have a matchmaker who betroths you to somebody that you do not want to marry, and you're in a culture where you don't have a lot of control over that, it's one of very few options for getting a wedding called off. Because very often, if a bride was possessed, that was like a black mark, and suddenly the wedding would be called off and this woman would be free to go on with her life. And so I think there's a way in which, I think that plenty of these possession cases happened on some level, whether they were spiritual possessions or like women breaking free of societal norms. But they certainly happened.
You have me thinking about like an older woman who women go to sort of learn how to be a Dybbuk or how to be possessed by a Dybbuk,
That would be a great play.
I think so.
Well, you just had to act a little crazy, and you had to like do things that women weren't supposed to do. A lot of these stories are like women dressing in ways they weren't supposed to dress, women refusing to shave their heads, which you're supposed to do for marriage, women talking back, speaking in deep voices, right? So all of this stuff, women engaging in sort of lewd sexual behavior, like stuff that women just weren't supposed to do. But, I think that was the line you needed to cross to be seen as a Dybbuk, as a possessed woman.
You've uncovered and translated documents describing how the inaugural performance of the Dybbuk in 1920 was developed and received. As you mentioned, the play was debuted by the Vilna Troupe, which you describe as a renegade Yiddish theater company. What made this troupe so unconventional?
Well, in their minds, everything. They wanted to be completely different than any Yiddish theater that had ever come before them, and they were determined to do that in every way they could possibly imagine. So, completely different repertoire was really important to them, completely different rehearsal and acting style, and then even down to they used a different dialect. There was a Yiddish theater dialect. There was one dialect of Yiddish, the Berliner dialect, that everybody used in Yiddish theater. And it was just what everyone expected to see. And the Vilna Troupe said, no, we're going to use a different dialect, right? Everything different as much as possible. But they saw themselves as a literary high art theater. They wanted to put Yiddish theater on the map of European culture, which they kind of did. And they wanted to do plays that they saw as having only the highest literary value. They were art with a capital A. They wanted nothing of commercialism. They were idealists about the theater and about art.
You opened the Dybbuk Century with a discussion of the Coen brothers' 2009 film, A Serious Man, which begins with the turn of last century Yiddish language vignette in which a Dybbuk may or may not have possessed the body of an old rabbi who visits the home of a husband and wife and is stabbed by the wife with an ice pick. The viewer is left wondering if this was a murder or a necessary act of exorcism. The Coen brothers never divulged how this enigmatic scene connects to the rest of the movie. Do you have any theories?
I think I have a multiplicity of theories. I think that first of all, I think that the decision to have this sort of movie about a suburban Jewish man wrestling with everything about who he is, to open with this sort of old world, legendary, magical, because the film does kind of end in a magical realism place too. Weird things happen in the movie, weird destiny-like things. There's a lot of strangeness that comes into play, and that strangeness is set in a world that's much more like our own. But we start in this world of kind of magical Jewish superstition. So I think that there's something to that. I mean, I think that it's really easy to look at the past and say like, oh, they were so superstitious. We're so far past that. But, human beings believe in magical and impractical things all the time. And sometimes who's to say, right? So like so much of A Serious Man, I think, plays in that space where it's realism, but is it really realism? And it kind of gradually pushes you outside of it. And so I think there's some connective tissue there. But also maybe they just wanted to do a little scene in a movie in Yiddish.
That's sort of the way that they describe it, because they like to keep everybody wondering. They just sort of say, oh, it's something we got away with. But now that you're mentioning that, I think there is maybe a legacy of Yiddish theater and Yiddish storytelling in A Serious Man, because there are these sort of unanswered questions all over the place, which was kind of a feature of a lot of that literature.
Yes, this is like a sort of classic feature of Jewish storytelling, especially like the oldest kind of forms, unanswered questions, stories that start but don't end, stories within stories that start but don't end. So like the Tales of Nachman of Bratslav is a really great example of this. Tales from the 1700s written in Yiddish. They're part of a religious tradition, and also they sometimes feel almost like fairy tales. And so many of them have like a story that starts in one place, and you think it's going to be about the king and his son, but actually we never come back to the king and his son. We just go into some story that somebody else is telling, and now we're there for the rest of the time, and we never come back. Or like the 7 beggars, where we hear about these 7 beggars twice, except we never hear about the 7th one again. It's just left open. So there's a lot of moments in Jewish storytelling where you kind of don't close the quotation marks, right? Or like don't close the parentheses. And I think A Serious Man does some of that in really interesting ways.
Yeah, that actually makes the Dybbuk sequence the perfect beginning to that movie.
Yes, and it's a very open question sequence, right? What really happened and what does it mean?
Unlike other classic plays, Ansky's The Dybbuk is unusually malleable. You note that it never really had a fixed form, but has always been open to adaptations and readaptations. Why do you think this is?
This is really what all great plays do and have, right? Why was Shakespeare such a great playwright? It's not necessarily or even just because the way the plays are written is so good. Like sometimes, yes, but there's universal human ideas at play that can be understood and represented in multiple different ways. And so, of course, today, like the most radical Shakespeare production you could possibly do would be just super straight Elizabethan, right? Just set in the time. Like nobody does that because it's always a commentary on our world and whatever it's in conversation with. And like all the great lasting plays, that's what they are. That's what they do. So I think that, the Dybbuk is not alone in this, but the Dybbuk is one of those plays that I think has that richness and malleability and speaks to some really universal ideas about the purpose of life, about destiny and fate versus freedom of choice, about gender, about like intergenerational conflict, about like the human soul, and about the power of love. So like these are real universal ideas, and the Dybbuk creates kind of a big canvas for it. So some of it is that, and some of it is production history. And again, like Shakespeare is the same thing. Part of the reason that Shakespeare is so often produced in this very open-ended, in contemporary dialogue way is because that's become the tradition. And that's how people think of it. And the Dybbuk, very early on, each group that did the Dybbuk had their own take and added things to the play that weren't there in the first place, that then became kind of standard parts of the play, and had their own kind of aesthetic ideas and artistic ideas that they projected onto that canvas. So it became associated with artistic experimentation.
For members of our audience who want to maybe explore different versions of the Dybbuk, where is a good place to start?
Well, I mean, you could read my book, The Dybbuk Century, which has a lot of information about different kinds of Dybbuks. But other places to start, the play has been translated quite a few times in a few different versions, and there are several really excellent translations. You kind of can't go wrong. There is a film version of the Dybbuk, which is really, really interesting in its own right, from 1937, that is pretty widely available. In fact, I think the full film is available on YouTube, last I checked, with subtitles. So that is a really great place to start. There are some really phenomenal scenes, wild, phenomenal scenes in that 1937 film. So those are, I think, the best places to start, or maybe where you started, Jonathan, with the Sidney Lumet version from the 60s, which is also great.
What might the future hold for Dybbuks in our popular culture?
I think this play has a lot of life left in it yet. It's very popular in Eastern Europe. I think it's become a real vehicle, especially in Poland, for people to negotiate with the legacy of the Holocaust, with like this focus on ghosts and ghostly possession and spiritual possession. I think there's been a lot of really fruitful artistic work happening in conversation with that. I don't know. I'm still waiting for, I think somebody should make a really fantastic contemporary horror film that is based on this story. I think it's got those ingredients, and I think it could do really well. So maybe somebody will do that.
Well, I'd love to see that. Thank you, Debra, for joining us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.